Hi, I'm Devin Sears. I'm joined today by Chris Miles, who I believe will be jumping in here in just 1 second. Today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of a website, specifically decoding domains. Domain is obviously a critical part of your website and one of the main foundational pieces when you start going with your web presence. So before we get started into that, let's advance to the next slide. As I mentioned, I'm Devin. I am the field marketing manager here at Bluehost. My good friend Chris Miles is joining. He is the
Howdy.
product manager. And before we get into the content, let's go over a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, if you can hear us, drop a comment or something in the question box so that we know that we're coming through and that there's no audio issues. I guess that's the second part of this is if you do have questions, there is a question box where you can ask questions as we go through the webinar. I will be answering those questions to the best of my ability as Chris walks us through the subject matter. If there are questions that I can't answer, or if there's a lot of questions that seem to be a theme throughout this, then I will get those on a document and we will present those to Chris to answer to the entire group at the end of this during our Q&A portion. Also, the question that is most commonly asked in all of these webinars, will this be recorded and will we have access to it? Yes, it will be recorded. It is being recorded now, and probably 24 to 48 hours afterwards, everyone should get an email with a link to the recording, with a link to the slide deck, with a link to everything that you'll need with this webinar. So I believe that's all the information from me. I'm going to drop out, turn off my webcam so I can start answering questions, and let's turn the time over to Chris. Thank you so much, Chris.
Howdy. So, can you all hear me?
Coming through great.
Awesome. Cool. Let's get started. So, domains is a broad topic. There's a lot we could cover. We're going to be focused on a few key things. So, just as a quick summary, here's what we're starting with. First and foremost, how to choose a domain. There's a lot of things that it's probably a good idea to be thinking about when you're picking out a domain name for a project or a site or whatever you're doing. So we'll be talking about some of those most common concerns there. We'll be talking about once you have that domain, then how do you make use of it? How do you hook it up to a website? How do you hook it up to email? What are the things you even can do with it? Then there's just some advice on here's some things to watch out for as a owner of domains, and then just some concerns, things to keep in mind as a domain owner and as somebody who is looking for domains. So, starting in with the first topic that we have, how to choose a domain. So, before we get into that, firstly, to quote Seinfeld, what's the deal with? Well, what's the deal with domains? Why do domain names even exist, like example.com, google.com, bluehost.com? Well, the reason is the internet works based on addresses, and those addresses are easy for a computer to understand, which is great. But when the internet was first being developed, we needed a way to have these addresses, which we've got a list of addresses here. We needed a way for these addresses to be memorable and readable and consumable by humans, right? Because I'm looking at this list of numbers and it just looks like a list of numbers to me. It doesn't mean anything. But what domains do is they give a human readable way to translate that address into something actually useful. So like google.com, when you put that into your browser, that's going to be translated into a machine address called an IP, right? And so for each of these, there's actually a memorable, useful version of that address, and that's what a domain name is. Things like facebook.com, things like wikipedia.org. These are all domain names. And so, to answer the question, why do these things even have to exist? It's just a human version of an address So it's memorable, unlike the computer version of the address. Cool. So how to choose a domain? Because people can register their own. Anyone can do it. They're pretty cheap and it's pretty easy to do in terms of registration. Anyone can go to, bluehost.com/domains and see if something's available and register it. It's there's plenty of other companies selling domains too. So it's pretty easy, but there are some things you want to think about. And first and foremost on that list is branding, right? So when you're choosing your brand and when you're choosing your domain, those things kind of need to go hand in hand. And what I mean by that is that when you're first deciding for your project, for your website, your blog, whatever it is, when you're deciding what that brand is going to be, one of the considerations that should be a part of that decision is, can you get that brand name in a domain name? Similar to how you might be thinking about, can I get that in a social media handle? Is that available on Twitter? Is that available in other places? Well, being able to get a domain name associated with that brand, the domain name selection should be very early in that kind of ideation process for you. So when you're thinking through what's the name of my brand, be sure you're also including, can I get the domain? That way you're not super sold on the idea for a brand only to find out, I really can't get a domain for this, right? So very early in the process, people sometimes say, choose the domain before you choose the brand. I don't know if I agree with that, but it should be one of the considerations at the very least, that you can get a domain that seems to line up with your branding. If you think about it, similar to a first impression in person, for a lot of people, a domain name is going to be their first impression of your site. Whether they're coming from social media or somewhere else, oftentimes, because of the way the internet works, the first thing somebody sees about your website isn't always the homepage or whatever link. They're seeing the domain name because they got there somehow. Either they typed it in or something else. So that's kind of a first impression. So think that through. There's a lot of tools available online that you can use to say, okay, I've got a couple of ideas here, and I'm not sure which ones are available. And so if you just search on Google or your favorite search engine for domain name generator tools, there's a lot of really cool ones out there. Some of those ones also will go an extra step and even check social media profile names for you. And so if you're thinking, how do I do this? So for example, earlier in these slides when I was introducing myself, I introduced myself as Chris David Miles. And the reason I'm using all three names is because Chris Miles is a really common name. If I go on LinkedIn, I can find, I think, 2 other Chris Mileses that live in my city, one of which works in software. So it's just an unfortunate side effect of having a common name is, well, then how do you deal with that when it comes to domains? So one of the things I do is I use my middle name there because I was able to get chrisdavidmiles.com when I was deciding on a name for my personal blog, which so in the same sort of way, whether it's a personal brand or a professional brand or whatever it is, being able to look and see, hey, what's available out there? What can I register that's easy, that's memorable, that's different enough that if you search for this thing, you'll be able to find me. There's a lot of tools out there that you can find. So if you find one that also searches for social media, that's usually pretty useful. Another thing to try and keep in mind here is think through a bit about all the different ways that you anticipate people are going to be finding or using that domain name, right? If you're planning on doing a website, a blog, online store, anything like that, think about how you plan on getting traffic there, just at a high level. You don't have to have a full marketing strategy or anything like that. All I mean is, are you ever going to run TV ads? Are you ever going to run radio ads? Or is this just going to be ads online, or maybe you're not going to run ads at all. Maybe it's just going to be word of mouth, right? But if you're thinking about how people, like literally how people are going to find your site, that may influence the domain name, because whether or not a domain name is easy to say or easy to read or easy to differentiate between other similar sounding words is going to matter less or more depending on how you anticipate people are going to get there, right? So in the case of like a personal blog, well, it can probably just be your name if that's available, just because if you don't anticipate people searching for you other than maybe somebody looking for information about you online, that's totally fine, right? And you can get maybe a mailing list or something, and that's how people are going to get updates, or they'll find you on Twitter, and then you're sending out updates from there. So if that's your key concern, maybe it's not as important. But we'll get into more about phonetics and things like that later on. But just think through, how are people going to get to your site, and maybe that might influence your choice in terms of domains. So continuing on, let's say you've got a couple ideas, right? Or you've got an idea. Do some research into that name before you pull the trigger, right? Before you really do it. And the reason being, probably first and foremost here, make sure somebody else hasn't trademarked that. Um, Depending on where you live or what you're doing, you might find that an idea is so good that maybe you're not the first person to think of it. And if that's the case, it's possible somebody has trademarked that. And so it's really easy, actually, to search through trademarks. All you really have to do is do trademark search online and find the government website, uspto.gov. And then you can search through a trademark database and just, hey, whatever I'm looking for, let me just search for some keywords and just make sure there's no, big businesses with my the name that I'm going for. So it's just something to keep in mind. Yeah, Google it. See if maybe you've got a really cool idea or a catchphrase or something you're turning into a domain name. Make sure you understand a lot of the different ways that people are already using that. Or if there's maybe a negative connotation to it, or if there's something in the news that might change the way people are thinking about that phrase or whatever. It's just something to do of just as a totally neutral thing. Google what you're thinking of calling your site or your project or whatever, just to see what else already exists out there in the internet sphere that I should be aware of if I'm attaching my project or my website to this name. And of course, social media handles, right? And usually I'm searching for social media handles kind of at the same time that I'm searching for domain names. And it can sometimes be tricky because social media handles are if you think domain names are hard, at least those cost a little bit of money, but social media handles, those can be even harder to get. And it doesn't have to be an exact match by any means, but if you can get something close, okay, this would line up. It's just something to keep in mind, that you don't want to be stuck with, oh man, somebody already took this thing that I really want. And so if you can incorporate that early into the process, you might save yourself a little bit of time or worry later on. So another thing to think through in terms of choosing a domain is not just the availability, but also cost. So there's this thing you might already be aware of, maybe not, called premium domains, which is, if you ever, some registrars, the people who own are able to sell domains, have reserved certain domain names as being premium, because the value of the domain is immediately obvious even before it's used. So like google.com, perhaps it wasn't obvious right away why that would be so valuable in the future. But, I'm thinking about, like, my last name is Miles. Well, Miles is an English word. It's a noun. It's a short word. It's not very many letters. So miles.com it's immediately obvious how that would be popular. I could see like Delta Airlines wanting miles.com, or a credit card company maybe wanting miles.com. Currently, it happens to be owned by Bayer, and I've, emailed them. They don't want to sell it to me. Probably couldn't afford it even if they did. But the the idea is there's certain domain names that cost more money just because their value is obvious, and those domain names are usually things that are, one English word, or particularly nouns, .com, or even sometimes two English words, .com. And those can cost anywhere from $1,000 up to hundreds of thousands sometimes, or even more. So premium domains are, premium is a good way to put it. They can be expensive. So just because something is available, you can buy it, doesn't necessarily mean it's in the price range. So finding something that is not premium, but that is available, yeah, you can probably for 10 or 15 bucks snatch up a domain. So most of the time, that's what most projects are using, unless you already have like a really good budget for a domain. And another thing to think through is you can change your domain name later on. It's not something you want to do every day, but you can change it. And I have seen examples of very successful companies change their domain names, where they start out with like the .net version of their brand, or the .co, and then later on, when they get a little bit more money and they can drop $100,000 on a domain name because they're a very successful company, then they go back and they snatch up the .com. And so just because you don't have it now doesn't mean you'll never have it. But yeah. One thing to think through as well is if you can get variants and misspellings of your domain name. So if there's a word that's really commonly misspelled, or if a word that can be spelled in multiple ways, anytime there's the same character more than once, sometimes it's a good idea to buy the version of that domain that only has one character, because that's a really common misspelling. So like if I was to make up an example, like coollearning.com, if that was my domain name, I would probably also want to buy Cool Learning with one L in the middle rather than two, just because you'd be surprised how many people will spell it wrong in that particular way. So trying to think through, maybe it's worth it, maybe it's not. It depends on the budget of your project. But if there's a lot of word of mouth, if there's ever like radio ads, or you anticipate people typing in your domain rather than getting there from links, this is more important. If probably the only way anyone's going to get to your site is through links, variants are less important, unless you're worried about people like competitors stealing them up. Go for .com if you can. Now, this is actually kind of a disputed point. There's plenty of people that will tell you, hey, you don't have to get .com. And they're right, you don't. There's actually some really cool domain names out there now that aren't .com or .net. There's a lot of different really cool things. But one piece of advice I would give is that if you're not getting the .com, just be prepared to explain that it's not the .com virtually every time you tell someone the domain name. That if it, like, I owned a domain name for a little while called mischief.media, and the company was Mischief Media, and it was just a small little thing where I would publish some stuff. But because I didn't own mischiefmedia.com, I owned mischief.media. It looked really cool in a browser, and it looked really cool in links. But anytime I had to tell anyone the email address, email me at chris@mischief.media. No. And I'd have to explain to them. So it's just something to think through, that you basically have two choices. You can get a .com, or you can explain every time you tell someone the domain name that it's not the .com. At least that's my take on it. But that's something people have different opinions on. Country codes are a thing that might matter depending on your audience. So if your audience is going to always be exclusively in a certain geographical area, like a certain country or a certain region. Country codes might be a good indicator of that for that audience, to where if you're working in a field where you want it to be specific, there are sometimes really big cities where you can buy like for example, you can buy .nyc for .New York, you can buy .la. And countries, basically, I think every country, if not most countries in the world, have a regional, what's called top level domain. So there's like .com, but also .eu for European Union. There's .jp. There's the different countries. And in fact, a lot of times those variant domain names that you see, like .co, they're actually originally started as a country, right? Like, for example, I own miles.cm, which I thought was clever because it's my last name and my initials. It's just that I have to spend all this time explaining to people, no, not .com, but .cm is Cayman Islands. So yeah, country codes really are probably only a good choice unless if your audience is from a particular region, or if you just really, really want a certain domain name. So, and one thing to think through as well is when you purchase a domain name, you purchase it in units of time, in terms, usually a year at a time. You can buy more than 1 year, but usually people buy a year at a time. And one thing to keep in mind is that it's actually really common for the price of that domain name to not be the same for subsequent years. So you might be able to save a little bit of money by buying multiple years at once. And the other thing to think through is sometimes registrars will do a thing where it's slightly cheaper the first year, and then there's a set rate. Or maybe it's slightly more expensive. In the case of premium domains, you only pay an exorbitant sum that first time, and then it just renews at a regular, 10 or 15 bucks or whatever. So just something to keep in mind, that be aware of what the renewal price is going to be, because it might not be the same as what you're paying up front. Other considerations, we talked about, think about how traffic will get there, right? If it's a lot of word of mouth, if it's radio ads, if it's TV ads, then phonetics matter a lot. If it's just links, then phonetics don't matter, and we'll cover that a little more later. Another advice I like to give people is to find a niche online, and maybe that's something you've heard before, is to find something that you can carve out as your own kind of little corner of expertise, or something that you're doing that perhaps others aren't doing as well, or in the way that you're doing it. And so you want it to be unique, you want it to be memorable, but you also want to leave yourself a little bit of room to grow, right? So if I'm writing a personal blog for myself, I could do something like, chrismilestechtips.com. But then if I ever want to do anything other than tech tips, I'm kind of in this little box of, when I registered the domain 2 years ago, yeah, that's what I was going to do. But now I want to publish I want to publish my artwork, I want to publish my poetry, or whatever it is. So depending on your project or your business or whatever it is, imagine if Amazon.com had instead done buybooksonline.com. That would kind of put them in a little bit of a box. But, Jeff Bezos understood that, hey, selling books is actually just the beginning. We're gonna sell a lot of different things. We're gonna expand into a lot of different markets using technology. And so how this applies is that, yes, you want to carve out your corner of the internet. You want it to be niche. You want it to be specific to you, but just niche enough. Or in other words, not so specific that you're inside this little box. Shorter is usually better, which is pretty straightforward. That the longer your domain name is, the more specific it is, people usually like shorter domains. there's a lot of places you can buy domains. Bluehost is one of them. Bluehost is on my top 1 list of domain name providers, and I am a little biased since I do work for them. But yeah, there's a ton of places you can buy domains online. Bluehost, Google sells domain, Cloudflare, believe it or not, sells domains. GoDaddy is one. There's a ton. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about phonetics. We've hinted at that a bit, but like when you're thinking through how you're going to describe this to people, is it easy to say or write or remember? Because even if you're only going to be using your website, people are only going to get there through links. If you're ever planning on using that domain name for email, well, you may end up having to spell out that domain name with words. So I'm going to use a couple quick examples just to illustrate what I mean. So let's say I've got an idea for a site and it's here for now. And for people that are just listening in that don't have this visual aid, I'll describe what I'm doing in just a minute. But if my idea is here for now, and I just tell people, oh, herefornow.com, that might work, herefornow.com. But they might also hear herefornow.com, or yearfornow.com, or yearfornow.com. if you notice, all of that sounded very, very similar. And so for anyone just listening in, I listed out 4 different ways to spell something that sounded like here for now. One was year, one was your, one had the number 4. And even if you want to be, okay, well, let's be more specific, here and now. Well, do you mean here and now? Do you mean hearing now? Do you mean here and now? Do you mean here and now? So it's just something to think through, that if you've got it's one of the reasons why big companies will sometimes register a domain just for a specific campaign, right? That it has to be something that is memorable and somewhat phonetic if you're ever doing things like radio ads. So one way to watch out for that is if you're looking for alternates, you can, if you want, just register all of them, right? Register all of the alternates, because domains are relatively inexpensive. Things like affect or effect or here, or accept, like things like that. If you register the kind of variants or misspellings or things like that, it can sometimes be helpful. So continuing on, here's some things that are you should watch out for. If your domain name is difficult to read, that might be a problem depending on how people are going to be getting to your site. If your domain name is difficult to say, that might be a problem depending on how people are going to get to your site. Easy to mistype, like we talked about with here and now. So easy to mistype is a problem. Hyphens, unfortunately, get a really bad rap when it comes to domains. And the reason for that is that very, very early on in search engines, they did, particularly Google, would give a lot of ranking if you had kind of an exact keyword match in the domain name. So if you were selling cheap comic books online, then if you had a domain name that was cheap-comic-books-online.com, you would show up in the first page, regardless of how good or bad your site was, just by virtue of, hey, we found a match. And because of that, a whole bunch of people bought up a whole bunch of hyphenated domains like that, and it ended up giving hyphenated domains kind of a bad name. So yeah, it's just something to watch out for, that hyphens get a bad rap. So someone else's trademark is something we already talked about, which is, be sure to look that up and make sure you're good. Too generic, something we discussed a little bit already, which is if it's so vague that it's difficult to remember or doesn't really mean anything, that's probably not a good thing. And keyword stuffing, cheapcomicbooksonline.com. You're kind of putting yourself in a box, and that sort of tactic doesn't work in search engines anymore. And people will see that and think, ooh, that seems a little sketchy. I don't know. Let's do a quick recap of how to choose a domain. Branding, which is domains or first impression. Do your research, consider availability, try to get the .com, keep it short, and some things to watch out for. So let's run through a quick exercise on how to choose a domain.
Okay, so we're just going to run through some of the principles that Chris just talked about. I'm going to try to do this involving the question portion of this. So y'all have had a bunch of great questions, and I've been trying to keep up with them as best as I can. So if I haven't gotten to your question yet, don't worry, I will try to get there. However, let's see if we can crowdsource some responses to this. Let's pick a topic that we want to try to find a domain for. Chris, why don't you give us the topic?
Okay. Landscaping. I need to do my lawn, so that's kind of on my mind right now. Let's do landscaping.
Okay, so step one, let's come up with, as we can see in the slides, we're going to ask a couple qualifying questions, but I like to start with a keyword exercise. So for anyone that's listening in right now, let's just crowdsource. If you're in chat, what are some keywords that go around with landscaping? You know, when you think about landscaping, what are some words that maybe come to mind? And I'll start us out while people are thinking. And you can just drop these into the question window if you'd like. I think landscaping, if I am looking for a landscaper myself, I want someone that is quality. I want someone that maybe has a specialization, maybe in something like turf or drainage, depending on the issue. I'm seeing greenery. Lawn obviously is a big one. Greenery is a great one as well. Yard, green, grass. These are all great. Grass is a big one, obviously, with landscaping. So we now have this small list of keywords that are in a certain area of landscaping, right? From there, I like to say, ask a couple qualifying questions. You know, Chris talked a little bit about the locale can weigh into it, you know, your geography, but first let's look at how. Okay, so with how, it's like, how do we do our landscaping? What do we really want to convey? If I meet someone on a bus, you know, if I only have 15 seconds to kind of pitch my business, I want to be able to convey something quickly. So in my mind, maybe something like expert landscaping or quality
I would
landscaping.
want to know, are you any good?
Good landscaping, definitely not bad landscaping.com, you know, something along those lines where you can convey how you do it. And obviously, depending on what the domain and the topic is, that will change dramatically. The next is what. So is it something like if you have a specialty that you really want to focus on, like drainage landscaping or turf landscaping. Let's see if we have any others in here. Oh, y'all went off, and this is great. Weeding, flowers, mulching, trimming. For me personally,
or maybe landscaping and design or something, you know.
Yeah, landscaping and design. So not only will we mow your lawn, we'll help you design it so that you can have it looking great. If it was my actual company based on my lawn, it would be patchofdirt.com. That's what I think it would have to be. So I could definitely use some landscaping help as well. Very nice, Mike. Mike put 4 seasons in there. So we also have mountains, timely fertilizer. So within what, you know, like something like sustainable gardening, you know, that really brings home your specialty. The next question, as far as a qualifying question, where? This is geared towards people that have a more localized business, right? If you're just a brick and mortar, if you're a local bakery, if you don't do shipping to far distances, going with the landscaping idea, I'm based in Texas, so I don't necessarily want someone from Nebraska reaching out to me saying, hey, can y'all come and help me with my lawn? I could really use some help. Like this, landscaping is not something that's going to be a global business. So in that situation, it might be beneficial to say, hey, let's do something like Austin Lawn Care. And then for the other qualifying questions, who, this again won't be applicable for everyone, but if you're doing a class, if you're ever educating, then I think it's helpful to put like art for beginners or
Right.
site design for beginners. Landscaping for beginners, that sounds maybe like not, that sounds like a place
Like
I'd want to go to learn how to fix my lawn, not
teaching or
necessarily a
something.
company I'd want to, yeah. But you can speak to who your company is for. A really quick example, and then we'll continue going with this. Uber, initially, their domain was Uber Cab, not just Uber. So within the name Uber Cab, it told you what they were. They were a cab, and then obviously as they gained national and global notoriety, they were able to drop the cab part, and the word is just recognized now.
Right.
But until then, you can go with a smaller segment and kind of convey what your business is within the domain itself. So looking at everything in here, you all gave some great suggestions. Sustainable designs, yeah. So landscape for lazy, I need that.
Oh, I
For,
would hire
and
them.
that's a great example. That's a great example from the comments for who, landscape for lazy. That tells you who it's
Like
for,
I
and
don't
that
want to do
resonates
any
with
of the
me.
work. I want somebody to show up and do the whole thing for me. That's perfect.
Exactly. So landscape for lazy, someone go check out that domain. Um, as I'm thinking about this, here in Texas, I kind of like Austin lawn design. I don't know why, that just kind of resonates with me. It has the lawn aspect in there. It has a design. It feels like a design seems like there's some level of proficiency with it, and based in a very specific location. So I also like that it kind of rhymes. That could just be me. This is not necessarily best practice, but Austin lawn, that has a good flow to it.
I have some good news, Devin. Austin Lawn Design is available for registration at
Hey,
bluehost.com/domains.
well, someone in here buy it, establish a company, and then I'll hire you to come fix my patchofdirt.com. But yeah, this was just a really quick exercise that we wanted to run through just to kind of walk through how that process would go. Obviously, the best way to do this would come up with these lists, come up with these questions, kind of work through it yourself, and then come up with 4 or 5 different domains that you feel like could be a good solution. Then I would take those domains and I would see if those domains were available. And if they are, don't purchase them yet. If the domain is available, the next step is to see if the social handles are available. If you want to have a presence on social media, you want to make sure, as Chris mentioned earlier, even more rare than finding the perfect domain is finding the perfect social handle, because those are
Right.
so easy to just snatch up. So I would take a look, and hopefully out of those 5 that we were able to come up with, one of them would have the domain available and the social handle available, and then from there you can purchase the domain and you can keep on moving.
And it doesn't have to be an exact match. Just has to be close enough that people can understand they're related, and it seems sensible that hey, these two things were probably got at the same time. Well, cool. That was a fun exercise for this next section. So now you've got the domain of your dreams. How to use a domain. This section's shorter, but what it really comes down to is kind of 2 categories of things. We'll cover those categories. So first, website hosting, which is anytime you go to a website that needs a hosting provider. So you've got a domain name. If you want a website to go with that, or a blog, a online store, even if you just want to redirect it to your Facebook page or something, like having that is your own little plot of land that says this is my thing that I own and I can do with it what I want. So website hosting is one option for if you wanted to put anything online, and then also email hosting. And these two aren't mutually exclusive; they go together oftentimes. And so if you want, for example, branded email. So let's say you work for what was the I think it was austinlawndesign.com. Well, when Devin decides his side hustle is doing lawns, and he might want to create email addresses like devin at austinlawndesign.com. And you can do that with branded email. And so um, sometimes what people will do is they'll just create an email forwarder for that, so where they have their personal email they already use and it'll just forward. Or sometimes they'll actually pay for a provider. So we'll go into some quick detail into how that can actually work. So how do you get a website? Well, you need hosting. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can transfer your domain name to the hosting provider is one option, but you don't have to. Basically what this is domain registration is one thing and hosting is another. So domain registration is just reserving the name itself, and hosting is basically buying a website and buying some space for that website. You could think of it almost as imagine a world where buying an address and buying a house were separate, right? That's kind of how the internet works, where you can buy an address without actually buying any land. And the reverse is also true, that if you want to get started on your site, you don't actually need a domain, at least not with Bluehost. But it's good to have a domain before you publish to the world or start sharing it for other people. But you don't have to transfer your domain name to use it with a hosting provider. You can just use the infrastructure of the internet that exists and tie a domain name that you own to any hosting account that you own. And every host supports this, where you log into your account with your domain name provider and you provide some technical details that will point that domain name to your hosting provider. And any host would be happy to help you with that process. Or anyone that sells you a domain would be happy to help you with that process. So I don't get into the details of how to do that here, just because it's going to be different depending on where you bought the domain and who your hosting provider is. But if you buy them together, then that's easy because they're already set up. But any hosting provider would love to help you with that. So should I transfer a domain or just point it? It's up to you. Some people like keeping everything under one roof, just so that you've only got to keep track of one set of billing information. Some people prefer to keep things separate. It's a personal choice, and we can get into more into that if people have more questions in the Q&A. So that's for websites. For email, it's a very similar process. You need email hosting. We talked about email forwarding versus branded email, but there's some good providers out there. Google Apps is a good provider. Office 365 is what I use personally. But yeah, there's a lot of providers out there that are really good. Both of those have really good mobile apps and good integrations and come with other software that's useful. Lots of times you can get email for either free or really cheap with a website hosting plan. A lot of web hosts do that. Bluehost does that. That I would say that typically speaking, the products that are focused specifically on branded email tend to be a little bit better. So like Google Apps is a really good option for a business. Office 365 is a really good option for a business. But if you're looking for something really cheap, and your hosting provider offers cheap or free email, and that's good enough, yeah, you save a little bit of money and just use whatever your web host has. Things to watch out for. These are just a couple quick, hey, watch out for these. Won't take too long. Make sure you keep track of when your domain names expire, right? If you can set them to auto renew, great. But lots of times people buy domain names for a year at a time or sometimes longer. And when that happens, it's not uncommon for your credit card to be a different number at the end of that year. So if you put something on your calendar on your phone to remind you, hey, and they're going to send out emails as well. Everybody does, but it's really easy to miss those emails. So just keep track of those expiration dates, because you don't want that to lapse, because people will buy it up from you. Another thing to watch out for is it's extremely common for after you buy a domain, for whatever company, Bluehost does this, so does just about everyone else, for them to ask you to verify that email address that you did. So you'll buy a domain name and you might get an email a day later or so that says, hey, can you prove that you own this email address? If you do, just log into your account here. So that's something to watch out for. Up-to-date billing, we discussed briefly, which is just make sure to keep your credit card up to date and some of those things, especially if you want auto renew to work. If you want auto renew to work. One thing to keep in mind too is if your email and your website are hosted in different places, and you ever make any changes to DNS, if you're not 100% sure that the changes you're making are going to do what you think they're going to do, call up your web host or your email host or whoever and get their help with it, because they would love to help you with that kind of thing. And if records are put in incorrectly for a domain, it can interrupt website traffic, it can interrupt email traffic. So if you're not sure what DNS is, it's probably not going to be a big concern unless your email and your website are not hosted together. So domain privacy is something to watch out for as well, which is there's international regulations around domains that require contact information to be on file for domain names, and there's those governing bodies. They're like governments, but for domains. Those governing bodies publish those records online. They're public records. But one of the things that lots of companies like Bluehost do is they're willing to offer a service where we'll actually publish our own records instead, meaning that rather than your name and whatever else being on those records, we'll just say Bluehost customer and list, Bluehost.com is the contact rather than you. So that's a service to watch out for, because it can be really nice to have. When your domain name, if you want to transfer your domain name, there's a process to do that, to like change it from one company to another company. And unfortunately, there are people out there that will try to trick you into stealing your domain. And so one of the things to watch out for is your domain name, through most reputable domain name providers, will be locked by default. And what locked means is that no one can transfer it away. You have to unlock it to transfer it. And so there are going to be people potentially that may try to email you and say, hey, you need to unlock your domain for this or that. Unless you're transferring your domain, you don't need to unlock it. So just be mindful of that. Another thing is if you're transferring a domain name, that process takes about 2 weeks. So it's not something that happens in a few seconds. So it's just, if you do transfer a domain, keep in mind you're in it for a couple of weeks. Cool. We already talked about this a bit, which is that hosting, web hosting, like a website, and email hosting aren't the same thing. But oftentimes you can save a little bit of money by most web hosts will give you a free domain name if you sign up for like a year plan or something like that. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're not sure what you're going to call your website yet, Bluehost actually will let you still work on your site without a domain name. We'll give you a temporary one, and then you can, once you decide on your domain name, we can help you switch that over. And you don't have to buy your domain name and your hosting at the same time. So if you already have a domain from somewhere else, that's totally all right. You can totally use that with Bluehost, or vice versa. And just as a quick last minute parting thought, there was a lot of information here. Keep in mind, you don't have to know everything. Your domain name choice isn't totally final. Even companies as big as Uber change their domain names sometimes. So Uber Cab changed to Uber. It's okay. You can change your domain name. It's not something you want to do every day, but you can do it. You can and should reach out and get help if you get stuck. There's a ton of resources online, and there's a ton of really cool tools online for you to use. But one in particular that I'm going to recommend is that Bluehost has 24-hour support for our customers. So always available. You can pick up the phone, you can do chat. I prefer chat personally, to chat in or call in and ask questions about, hey, I'm how does this work? I'm trying to do this. How do I accomplish this? I'm stuck on this piece of something. How do I do it? So just something to keep in mind, that you don't have to solve everything yourself. You're not in this alone. There are people out there that can help you. Bluehost is one of them. Yeah, you can find them bluehost.com/contact. We might want to skip over this. I think we're running short on time. Devin, how are we doing on time? We've got a few minutes, I think.
Let's get to some questions. Yeah, we've got a few minutes and we've got some great questions.
Let's skip through this. And oh, there's one last thing I wanted to share, which is a funny story. One last quick tip. Once you have an idea for your domain, once you finally settled on, austinlawncare.com or whatever, snag it up, because other people might snag it up if you don't. Here's a funny tweet. Coffee shop. People next to me are loud and rude. They just found the perfect name for their new business. I just bought the domain name. I don't know if that's a true story, but it made me laugh. Anyways, let's open it up for some questions.
All right, I'm gonna turn on my webcam so we can talk face to face. So there's a couple questions along the trademark side of things, and I am not a lawyer. I gave my best legal advice with the disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer. You might have more insight into this. The two questions that kind of came up were, one, if I have a website, can someone come in after me and trademark my website and then force me to give it up? Going off the example we came up with earlier, austinlawncare.com, austinlawndesign.com. If I buy that, build my website, have a small business, can you come in and file a trademark before I do, and for that domain, for that small business, and then force me to give it up?
This is a really good question. First, I want to preface with, this is not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I've never passed a law exam in any state. But I can tell you a little bit of experience about this, which is that if you're acting in good faith in terms of you have a working business, that people coming in with a similar thing, while disputes like that are possible, it certainly wouldn't hurt for you to trademark it yourself, or to start the business yourself. Certainly wouldn't hurt, I mean. And so if you're worried about that, or if you think that that's perhaps even likely, you can always do a trademark yourself. It's easier than you might think. So while it might be possible for somebody else to trademark something that you've been using, it certainly would help if you're able to demonstrate that, hey, I've been using this for something. But yeah, and again, this isn't legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, but if you're able to demonstrate that you're using it for something, that helps a lot. And if you are worried about it, you can always trademark it yourself, and it's not terribly expensive. It's not cheap, but it's not terribly expensive.
The other trademark question was actually kind of on the flip side of the law. Someone asked if can they go out and buy Facebook.com with a PH instead of an F, or will they have a trademark violation come after them? I suspected that it would, but I figured we'd ask you to see if you have any further insights on that.
If anyone wants to buy Facebook.com with a PH, just go to GoDaddy and register that. Just kidding. Don't do that. It's bad advice. That was a joke. You can do that. I wouldn't recommend it, because if Facebook was to find out about it, they would probably at the very least send you some letters and say, hey, we own the trademark on Facebook. Obviously, we have a claim to this, and there have even, to my recollection, I won't speak on any active legal matters, but there have been, in my recollection, even been times people have set up malicious versions of Bluehost.com, and we have had to do our due diligence and reach out and buy variants of the spelling of Bluehost, just to protect our own customers, so people aren't duped into clicking bad links. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Facebook is doing exactly the same thing with just as much diligence to say, okay, I don't know what this other guy is going to do with this domain. I'm going to buy it up just so that I don't invite a lot of unwelcome hassle for my customers.
Okay, the next question that I wanted to answer, are the renewal prices uniform across the board for registrars? Meaning if I buy, because I know that some companies offer a discount to get you in the door,
Yes.
but are the renewal prices the same? Does that matter, or can they? I'm
I'll
assuming that.
describe how it works. So it's a bit like cars in that there are dealerships, and dealerships are trying to make money. So you can usually when you're buying a domain name, you're buying it from a registrar, not a registry. The registry is the company that maintains the infrastructure for a particular, like a .com or a .net for every .com and .net, even though you can buy .coms and .nets for a lot of companies. So what that means is everyone who's selling domains has to pay a fee for each domain that they sell. And those fees are the same for every non-premium domain. So kind of like how dealerships are usually paying the same price for those cars, it costs them an amount of money to have them, and then they sell it to somebody else. So sometimes what companies will do is they'll sell for the first year at a loss and say, we're going to eat the cost of selling this really low in the hopes that people will renew. And then, or sometimes they'll say, hey, if you buy 10 years, we'll knock some price off the first year. And so there's really not a high margin on domains, usually, at least from the perspective of the companies who are selling. Unless you're talking about premium domains, then there's crazy margins there. But yeah, are they all going to be the same price? They're not going to be the same price for you buying them, but the companies who sell them are all getting them for the same price, which means they're probably all going to be pretty close. They're probably going to be within $1 or $2, usually, because they're, if it was way more money, people just wouldn't buy it because they'd say, well, I could go somewhere else and get it cheaper. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes. Okay. Well, I hope so as well. It sounds like a great answer to me. Let's see. Can you set up an alert for when a domain becomes available for purchase?
I am aware that services like that exist. Bluehost unfortunately doesn't offer anything like that. But I do know that there's companies that specialize in trademarking that do that, like Mark Monitor does that, and some others. But the most common version of that is when a new TLD, a TLD is like the ending, like a .com. The most common version of that is when a new TLD is made available to the public. Lots of times, one company will get the first shot at selling it, and they can actually sell what are called pre-registrations, which is, hey, once this becomes available, I want first dibs on buying this particular domain. And so those are really common. But yeah, there are services out there that you can find. So I would recommend just Googling like notify when domain becomes available and find one that looks reasonably priced. You'll probably won't find one for free.
I've got a few more questions. We've actually got a handful, but I don't want us to go too much over time. So I've got 2 or 3 more questions I'd like to ask, and then we'll try to get to all of the questions that we can in the blog post that will be in that email in the next day or two. So there's 2 questions about selling a domain. So if someone has a domain that they think people will want, for example, venicecondo.com, how do I know how much to sell it for?
That's a really good question. There are automated domain value estimators online. In my experience, they're not very accurate because they're based on very, very simple algorithms. But what you can do is similar to placing a value on a home. The same way what people often do is they look at other homes in the neighborhood that's sold. You can do the same thing with domains and say, okay, venicecondos.com, Venice condos, those are 2 nouns in English, .com. What are other location-based 2 English noun domain names.com's selling for? And you can find that online, and yeah, you'll probably into the 1,000 range easily with that too. I would, off the top of my head, estimate between $2,000 and $10,000 on that, or might even be higher. But yeah, there are tools that will estimate it. I wouldn't trust them. I would just look around at similar domains and see what those are going for and what people are asking for at the very least.
The other suggestion I had with that was to look into Flippa, FLIPPA.com. I know that they sell websites that are built. Sometimes they'll also sell domains that are standalone. And I think they're kind of similar to eBay, where they have a few different pricing models where you can set it up for an auction, like a bid style. So you could just see what number it goes up to.
I've never used that service, but there's a lot of auction sites that are really good for that. Sedo is one I've used before. I believe GoDaddy has an auction service that I assume is good. I've used Sedo, but yeah.
Someone else asked, what was the trademark website? I missed that. You mentioned earlier a trademark website.
Yeah, so for that, here's how I found it. Trademark lookup US. And then just look for something that ends in .gov. So here we found uspto.gov. And we'll put that in the blog post as well. But literally, I never remember what this is called. I Google it every time. I just say, how do I look up trademarks? And Google tells me every time. But that's it.
Okay, and the last question that I want to end on, how do I buy a .com domain that is already bought but is unused, or even just any domain if it's not even a .com domain?
I love this question. You have a couple of options. You can, remember when we talked about how there's records online? Those are public records, which means what you'll want to look up is called Whois, WHOIS. Whois, find a Whois service online. They're free. There's a bunch of them. So like if I wanted to find who owned Bluehost.com, I would find a Whois service and then do a lookup of that domain. Let's see, who owns Bluehost.com. And then from there, we would try and figure that out. Okay, so and you can read about who owns that. Try and get in touch with them. They'll find the records online of their email. I know in one case there was a domain name I wanted to buy that was taken. It didn't look like anyone was using it. So I found the email address. They didn't use domain privacy, so I found their email address. I emailed them and I said, hey, I'll pay you $1,000 for your domain. Do you want to sell it to me? And unfortunately, I still haven't used it, so I'm just as bad as he was. But I had a lot of really cool ideas of what I wanted to do. But yeah, sometimes people will just sell it to you. There's also brokerage services that will reach out on your behalf. I've not heard many success stories doing that, but I know those services exist. So it's just something to think about. But yeah, I would. The first thing I would honestly do if a domain name is unavailable is I would look for another domain that is available. But if you're really, really sold on one specific domain, try to figure out who owns it, see if you can get in touch with them. And as a last resort, maybe look into one of those expensive brokerage services, but they're not cheap.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, for coming on and teaching us about domains. Thank you for everyone that participated, and thank you for everyone that helped us with the keyword exercise. That was a lot of fun. I appreciate everyone that contributed and participated today. If we didn't get to your question, I deeply apologize. I will do everything I can to make sure that they are answered within the FAQ section of the blog post, which should be up later today or tomorrow at the latest. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch y'all soon.